Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the third evening in the Northumberland Learning Connection Migration Series. My name is Mary Latke, and as a member of the NLC's program committee, it is my pleasure to be moderating Return, the Call of the Homeland, featuring Kamal Al-Solaylee. I'd like to start this evening with a brief land acknowledgement. Northumberland County is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples. This land has been inhabited and cared for by Indigenous peoples for thousands of years and is territory covered by the Williams Treaties. I come with respect for this land that I am on today and for its past and current inhabitants. I first encountered Kamal's work as an incisive and thoughtful journalist for publications including the Globe and Mail, Walrus Magazine, and the Toronto Star. Later, I read his books including Intolerable, his award-winning memoir published in 2013, Brown, his groundbreaking 2016 exploration of race in the 21st century, and more recently, the book which will inform his talk tonight, Return, Why We Go Back to Where We Have Came From, published in 2021. In a review of Intolerable, a memoir of extremes, Matthew Hayes of the Globe and Mail called it a beautiful book about a family's tortured relationship to history and a region's fraught relationship to modernity, everything a great memoir should be. About Brown, Doug Saunders, who recently spoke to the NLC, gave this high praise. It is an extraordinary book. Kamal Al-Solaylee gives a name, an identity, and a story to the disparate billions whose labors, migrations, and struggles define our time. A stirring narrative, an empowering manifesto, and an unprecedented bid for recognition. This book will change the way you see the world. Kamal's writing unearths and explores the challenges presented by our globalized post-colonial world, weaving personal experience, identity, and larger historical shifts together with clear-eyed purpose and prose. Dr. Al-Solaylee is currently the director of the School of Journalism, Writing, and Media at the University of British Columbia. Tonight, he will explore one of the most natural but frequently misunderstood human experiences, our desire to return to place of origin, the homeland. Why do immigrants and refugees leave their adopted home countries to seek a connection with a place they or their parents, or in some cases ancestors, left behind willingly or by force? How do we define belonging or identity in a world where the line between here and over there and our now and back then is becoming harder and harder to tell apart? The idea of homeland returns as an integral part of the movement of people and our understanding of global migration, and has received little attention from writers and scholars. In his talk, Professor Al-Solaylee, who traveled widely to report return, shares with us a subculture of returnees whose stories are inspiring, funny, and surprising. We will be leaving time for your questions, so please feel free to submit them via the question and answer function. Over to you, Kamal.
All right. Thank you so much, Mary, for that wonderful and warm introduction. I feel like you explained my work much better than I can, so I could just let you talk, and I'll just sit back and listen to you instead. But thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by also thanking everyone from Northumberland Learning Connection. Barbara Woolley, Karen Stanworth, Nedra Duran-Camp, Elizabeth Ivory, for inviting me to give this talk, and also to Charlie Foran. I think, Mary, you know that guy, for suggesting my name and this book. Sorry I can't be with you in person. I am in Vancouver. It's the last week of term. As Mary mentioned, I'm a university professor, because I don't make money from books. Being a university professor at this time means I'm in marking and a grading rabbit hole. So So in many ways, I want to double thank you because preparing this talk and revisiting my research on return migration, which I haven't really had a chance to revisit for a couple of years, has been a pleasure and a welcome escape. I too would like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from the unceded Musqueam land here in the University of British Columbia, a place that has been a site for gathering, sharing, and learning. And it is in this spirit that I join you remotely today. Before I go any further, I just want to make sure that the sound, everything's okay. Sound, okay. If I don't hear otherwise, then everything is fine. In the next hour or so, I'm going to talk to you about returns and read various excerpts from the book. So it's both a talk and reading. I'm going to hold the book and read from it. So I'm sorry if it feels like self-promotion for the book, but I just prefer to read. When it comes to reading part, I prefer to read it from the book and not from screen. There are many things that I can't do because I am joining you remotely. And one of them is that if I were in the room with you in person right now, I'll probably start by asking you, the audience, to tell me what are some of the first things that come to mind when you hear the word return? Like what, I mean, maybe if you are joining us all virtually, maybe just think about it. And at the Q&A answer, you could probably share some of those thoughts with us. I'll tell you quickly what some of the initial responses from friends, family, colleagues, even my agent, what were the responses when I first mentioned, I'm going to be spending 4 years of my life researching, reporting, writing a book about return migration. I believe the amazing Doug Saunders opened this series with a talk called Who's Coming to Canada? On some level, I'll try to answer the flip question, who's leaving Canada? But also take it more beyond Canada. Who's leaving the countries that they've worked so hard to get into? They could be your parents who worked hard to get here, your grandparents. You could be fifth, sixth generation Irish, and suddenly you go to one trip to Ireland and next thing you know, you are setting up your life there. Who's going back to where they come from? And more importantly, why? Why do they do that? Why do we do that? When I first mentioned my interest in return migration, many people assumed that I'd be writing about the reverse of outward migration, the reverse of refugeehood. That by talking about return, I am trying to negate the outward journey, the journey of refugees from homeland to a safe harbor. Or that I'm working on a book about the country of origin and not the host country. So I think, for example, there's a chapter in the book set in Taiwan, and I did report it from Taiwan, but I was not necessarily just looking at Taiwan. I was also looking at the US and Canada, the countries from which all my characters left to go back to Taiwan. And because I subtitled my book, Why We Go Back to Where We Come From, many viewed it, and I have to admit, I thought about it in those terms at first as well, as a book about retreating, about abandoning new lives in favor of the past, of the old. Some thought it is a book that platforms, or at the very least, explains the racist chant of go back to where you come from. There's some truth to all or some of the above. But like all creative writing, the first impulse is the personal and a very simple question. Please allow me to read from the introduction to the book. Where do you want to be buried? Since my date and I were walking alongside Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Midtown Toronto, the question didn't seem didn't come as a complete surprise. Its morbidity threw me off nonetheless. I had planned this to be a romantic post-dinner summer stroll. My dream list of questions included, but was not limited to, do you want to move in together? And where would you like to go for our honeymoon? He and I had just braved the crowds at a nearby ice cream shop and devoured double servings of pistachio and chocolate gelato in a scene worthy of a rom-com. Toronto, I replied. Although I was born in Yemen, raised in Lebanon and Egypt, and educated in England, I had come to see Toronto and Canada as my homeland. I reveled in the kindness the city had shown me and the career opportunities it had afforded me. I dedicated my first book, Intolerable, to it for giving me what I'd been looking for, a home. In my second, I called it my sanctuary, a good place to be brown. My love affair with Toronto started the moment I landed at its international airport on April 20th, 1996. So that's almost 28 years ago now. Like many immigrants who have left oppressive regimes or escaped civil wars, I think of that arrival date as a second birthday, a parallel timeline in which life began just as I was about to turn 32. I no longer entertain thoughts of a secret, unled life because I finally had the one I wanted. I want to be buried in Sana'a next to my grandparents, countered my date, who was born near Detroit to a Yemeni family and had spent most of his adult life in the United States. Although he's a natural-born citizen, he didn't think that America deserved his remains because he'd never felt connected to it as a country of birth or of residence. I remember thinking how fortunate I was to claim a dot on the world map as mine, one place for my body to play, love, work, grow old, and when the time came, be put to rest. My date's words suggested an inner turmoil and unbelonging to which I was immune. That exchange took place in August 2012. Barack Obama was 3 months away from winning his second term as a president of the United States. I knew Donald Trump mostly as a C-list reality TV who had cameos in Home Alone and on Sex and the City, and as the gauche multimillionaire behind the racist birther movement. Back then, very few journalists and university professors were willing to defend with a straight face the free speech rights of bigots or adopt a both sides approach to one race-based conflict or another, at least not publicly. If I were asked the same question today, almost a decade later, or at this stage more than a decade, 14 years, I wouldn't know how to respond. I suspect I wouldn't be as definitive about Toronto as I was once. My date's remark, which seemed irrational and troubling then, strikes me now as reasonable and in many ways prescient. Our relationship has ended, but the question lingers. Where do I want to be buried? I knew I had an uphill battle before I wrote a single word. And I also realized rather quickly that when I say the word return, people are hearing another word entirely. Homeland. I say return, they hear homeland. Their engagement with me is not about outward or inward migration. Probably heard more about that from Doug Saunders. You know, like when we talk about the patterns, the numbers, the reasons, the borders that control migration. It really, when I talk about return, it really comes down to homeland. One word, homeland, that has inspired thousands of poems, epics, novels, nonfiction books, over centuries, but has also triggered wars, led to ethnic cleansing and genocide. It's a word that invites extremes, suspicion and praise, love and hate, fear of the unknown and the comfort of the familiar. Just think about that word, homeland, and maybe later at the Q&A period, you can tell me what are some of the things that come to mind when you hear it. I know that a lot of people hear territoriality. As I talk to you, we are more than 2 years into a war between Ukraine and Russia over the independence of the former. And we are more than 6 months into another war in Israel and Gaza, possibly beyond the borders of those two people, because two nations, two peoples have different understanding of whose homeland it is, who has a right to return to it, and who should be exiled from it. President Xi Jinping of China talks of returning Taiwan to China at any cost. It's not a coincidence that earlier this week, the US Senate passed an aid bill worth $95 billion to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, and other global hotspots where wars and conflicts are underway over a conflict over homelands. In my first two books, Intolerable and Brown, I focused my gaze as a journalist, as an author, as a reporter, on the host countries that take in migrants and refugees, with a side glance at the ones that, quote unquote, export labor. Sri Lanka, the Philippines, for example. With Return, I wanted to reverse the gaze and focus on the places and connections that these very refugees and migrants left behind. Most often than not after some traumatic events or crushing economic realities. I argue that arrivals and returns are not separate identities or stages. It's not the before or after and after much beloved by Makeover TV. Arrivals and returns are continuous states of being. I'll explain why. In the 4 years it took to research return migration, a rich, if still relatively underexplored subset of migration studies, and in the 3 since publication, I have emerged with a deeper understanding of the unbreakable, in the blood, in the bones bond that immigrants have to their places of origin. This place could be Spain or Sri Lanka, the Netherlands or Nigeria. It really makes no matter. Homeland affinities are universal. And yet they're deeply confusing and misunderstood. I believe, and some of you may disagree, that you can't understand how migration changes the world. To use the theme of this wonderful series, it's almost like you guys created a series for me to come and talk about my book. You can't understand how migration changes the world without understanding the psychological bond of what was left behind. At the very least, understanding why there is always going to be sorrow and a sense of loss for people who were uprooted or chose to leave. The source of this sorrow and loss is the complex relationships migrants have with their homelands, and not just the struggle they face in the new world. I want to digress for just 30 seconds and say that I do not mean to underplay these struggles. You've probably read recent news stories that more than 50% of immigrants decide to leave Canada either to return to their homeland or migrate to another country within 20 years after admission as permanent residents. This is a study from Statistics Canada, although I think the cutoff point was 2017. Housing underemployment, and cost of living crisis are often cited as reasons for leaving. But I believe there's more to the story than material needs, much, much more. That's what she said before. As I write in the book, no matter what our country of origin or our faith or skin color may be, immigrants and displaced people crossing borders and seeking new homes suffer from a common delusion. Allow me to quote from myself for one sentence. In the book, I write that we think we take pieces of our homelands with us and leave parts of ourselves behind, as if we get to control how much rupture and dislocation we invite into our lives. The truth is that homelands have been loosening and tightening their grip on us. They sneak up on us when we think we have completed, they sneak up on us when we think we have completed the journey, that we're fully settled in our new homes, integrated. Like a siren song, they will call us back to another place and time. The older we get, the more powerful that call is, and the more we are in a position to heed it. When I was working on the book, and that was during the worst years of the pandemic, 2020 and 2021, I came across a wonderful quote from author Elif Shafak, a Turkish-British author, who describes homelands as castles made of glass. She writes, and I quote, "It is easy to forget that they are there and go on with your life, your little ambitions and important plans. But at the slightest contact, the shards will remind you of their presence. They will cut you deep." All right, I mean, some may say this is overdramatic, but I felt so familiar and so true to me when I read it. I finally felt seen. Why? Because my story it very much followed that pattern. Here's my story in very, very briefly. In almost every aspect, I'm the poster boy, old man, whatever you want to call it, for the fully integrated immigrant, a model Canadian citizen. I asked my accountant to not to mess with taxes. If Canada Revenue wants more money, do not deduct stuff that I don't need to, just pay I'm happy to pay my taxes. I arrived in Canada in 1996 from the Middle East via the United Kingdom, where I spent 8 years as an international student, ending with a PhD in English literature, no less. I'm a Victorian literature specialist, so technically the only thing I'm academically qualified to teach is novels published between 1860 and 1870, particularly if they happen to be about Wilkie Collins. After the obligatory struggle to find a job in academia or meaningful work in general, I stumbled on a career in journalism and media, starting as a freelancer in Toronto's indie newspaper, Extra and iWeekly, before moving on as a freelancer for the National Post and then a staff writer for the Globe and Mail. I think Mary may have alluded to it earlier, and some people may remember me as the Globe's grumpy theatre critic. With every year in Canada, I benefited from new opportunities, from doors other opened for me or ones I pried open, and from some very kind and warm Canadians. From there, I became a professor of journalism at Ryerson, now called Toronto Metropolitan University, and author of 3 books. And now I'm speaking to you from Vancouver, where I'm the director of UBC School of Journalism, Writing and Media. Immigrant success stories don't come more successful than this. So why am I suddenly thinking about Yemen, about my roots, about the legacy of my parents. I think in part is guilt. I had to abandon one of the biggest signifiers of my identity, my native tongue, Arabic, in order to achieve the success that I did. I'd like just to kind of take you into what that means to become tongue-tied, to become the person for whom your native language becomes your second language. Just going to read a brief excerpt from the book. My dereliction of Arabic was a conscious move and part of a journey of reinvention I embarked on in my late teens. The Quran, the holy book of the Muslim faith, is written in Arabic. As I was coming out as a gay man in the early 1980s and reading up on sexual liberation, I needed distance from both the religion and its official text, which I felt vilified my desire. English became more than a second language. It drew a personalized roadmap to freedom and dignity. I didn't see being gay as an experience that could unfold in Arabic. The language lacked the vocabulary and the textual resources to help me find out who I was, who I choose to love or sleep with. If anything, it mobilized hate and discrimination, which was against homosexuality, which was portrayed in literature and popular arts as a sin or an affliction. English, on the other hand, had it all figured out. What could be lovelier than the word gay to describe how I felt about myself? Happiness and joie de vivre lie at its roots. And what was more aspirational than the gay liberation movement, by then more than a decade in progress? Not even the emergence of AIDS at around the same time could dull my interest in English as a gay language. When I was about 19, I made it a point to stop reading or listening to Arabic, to speak it only when necessary, and to upgrade English from second to first language, a process that became more immersive when I moved to England at 24 to study literature and eventually earned a PhD in Victorian fiction. Arabic words and settings meant contamination, a corruption of my resolve to exile myself from my native tongue and homeland. All along, I picked up quite naturally and through exposure to mostly native English speakers, an English accent, which made me sound, if not posh or necessarily English, then at least educated and middle class in a country defined by class politics and resentments. To tell you the truth, I still don't know what to make of that comparison a former professor once made in describing me. He compared me to Eliza Doolittle's transformation from a Cockney flower girl to a refined society lady. I rewired my brain to think, speak, and write in English, burying Arabic deep in the recesses of my brain. I thought of my plans not as an artifice or a makeover, but as a means of countervailing my birth identity and establishing a real new self. This was the me I deserved. There could be no sexual liberation if the language that oppressed me still lived within me and came out of my mouth. I took classes in German and Spanish to further suppress my native tongue. Language has become a home. A Canadian author, Jessica Lee, writes in her book, Two Trees Make a Forest. My home was English. And despite being completely settled in Toronto and very happy, at some point around 2015 or 16, I would even argue, perhaps earlier than that, I began to feel this overwhelming and maybe irrational desire to leave Canada, to go home, to return to my country of origin, and to my native tongue, and to my place of birth, Aden, which I left when I was 3 years old and last visited more than 30 years ago. That's just insane. That's also what I wanted to do more than anything. Toronto, the city I dedicated my first book to, became less kind and more complicated. There were many people suffering on its streets and few willing to help. It didn't feel like home anymore. I used to look forward to coming home to Toronto after long trips. At the time, I looked for excuses to stay away longer. I retreated indoors and I kept looking at family photos from childhood and watching old Arabic movies and listening to old music. Nostalgia became a mode of living, thanks in no small part to the easy access to material on YouTube, a site that's becoming the collective memory of the world. I started to fantasize about going back in time as well as literally going back to where I came from. I was taken aback by this desire. I bet my life and my professional identity as the one who made it big in Canada. So why do I want to return to a country I ran away from and one that's in the middle of a brutal civil war, a country ravaged by famine, cholera, and COVID-19? At first, I felt the need to pathologize that desire. I kept asking myself, what is wrong with me? Is this a depression? And is return the cure I'm prescribing to myself? I also felt guilty. How ungrateful am I to Canada, the country that welcomed me with such open arms, to, to a degree where to this day, I wonder what if I arrived this year or last year, would I have been met with the same welcome? It took me many years and visits to the Basque region of Spain, to Northern Ireland, Jamaica, Taiwan, Ghana, Israel, and Palestine to realize that there is nothing wrong with me or with the millions of people who live between two worlds, who are home in Canada or the US, but long for that elsewhere, the homeland. People who wish to make a return to lost origins and a journey back to the beginning. Some express it in simple ways as cooking traditional food, wearing native clothes, keeping up on news from home. Others, like the people I spoke to, have taken it several steps further and decided to return to their homelands, to start anew in the old place, to commune with their past, their ancestors, and their ghosts. Some of their stories surprise me, but as long as there's been immigration, there's been return. Think of Homer's Odyssey. In essence, it is about its main character's Odysseus' decade-long journey to return home after the Trojan War. Return is both real and archetypal, a metaphor and an action. It's common among birds who migrate south and return north, depending on the season. In the natural world, there's a phenomenon called natal homing. It refers to the process by which certain marine animals make their way home to reproduce and inevitably end their life cycle. The list includes certain species of bluefin tuna, sea turtles, and of course, salmon, whose return is an annual event and tourist attraction here in British Columbia. The conversation among the world's large museums right now is not so much about new acquisitions, but the repatriation of art and artifacts acquired, stolen, looted, however you want to define it, from former colonies. Why is the bust of Nefertiti in a museum in Berlin? Why does France hold 90,000 objects from Africa alone? Should they too go back to where they came from? Return is everywhere, but we don't talk about it as much. When we talk about immigration, we always mostly talk about newcomers, about the outward movement. So, because this is the subject, migration is the headline of this series, I'm going to include you as a community of interest in issues related to migration. Why have we left return off the table when immigration scholars have called return the great unwritten chapter in the history of migration. In my book, I refer to an essay collection called Homecomings, Unsettling Paths of Return. The book is almost 20 years old now, published in 2004. But one of the editors writes that for the better part of the 20th century, that century that saw a lot of upheaval, two world wars, refugee crisis after refugee crisis, returns of immigrants, refugees, and exiles were hardly noticed by scholars, or at least not seen as phenomena of much academic interest. I'd like to offer a few possible answers, and I believe this is where someone like me, who's a writer, storyteller, with one foot in academia and another in creative writing, can contribute to the conversation of migration. You have other social scientists coming to talk to you, so this is a kind of a departure from the heavily academic take on migration. In writing the book, I explore the idea that returns challenge certain notions of identity, hybridity, multiculturalism. They upend some neat narratives about Canada as a safe harbor, a host country. Brand Canada benefits when we welcome refugees, when we open doors. Canada is a country of new beginnings, even when that has always come at the expense of the land's original inhabitants and caretakers. I want you to sort of cast your mind to the stories that were very prevalent in our media in around 1915-16, when the first wave of Syrian refugees started arriving in Canada. I remember writing at the Walrus at the time that the refugees became supporting characters in their own stories, while Canadians with various migration and cultural histories were cast as the lead, as the saviors. So a refugee or an immigrant who chooses to take that one-way ticket home or split their time between Canada and their homeland chips away at that pristine image and at a narrative of do-gooders and saviors that is very seductive. Scarce resources play a part in our perceptions of immigration. When the times are good, the arrival of immigrants is seen as a boost to the economy, a validation of the dynamism of the host country. The economy is booming, we need workers, there are jobs everywhere. This is the good times. But as stories of crisis in housing supply, of softening in the labor market, and again, the increasing cost of living, the finger pointing begins, and it is squarely pointed at the influx of new migrants to Canada, or refugees, or asylum seekers in Europe. So is the view of return migration as a question mark on newcomers' sense of belonging to Canada fair? When we say that people who come to Canada and then decide to go back to their homeland are Canadians of convenience, is that a fair assessment? Is it fair to Canada? Is it fair to the refugees and migrants who have called it home, sometimes for 20, 30 years? I want to make an argument that we need to recalibrate how we think about migration, not just as a one-directional move, but as a process encompassing multiple directions, where movement is not just from the developing to the developed world, from poor nations to affluent ones, from war zones to safe havens, from over there to over here, and then full stop. The narrative doesn't end there. Our life stories don't end with arrival. I'm not suggesting a revolving door either, because that's logistically a nightmare. But I'm suggesting something that allows multiple entries and exits. A system that reckons with the legacy and pull of homelands in the life of migrants and refugees. Even those who left their homeland after civil wars and all the traumas that they've experienced still manage to hold space in their heart and in their soul for the years of peace and tranquility that preceded the turbulence. The mental processes and the emotional connection can't always be absorbed by policy or theory. How do you legislate such an ephemeral experience? How do you come up with policies that factor in home cooking, childhood memories, first love, first kiss, high school jinx, or the warm embrace of parents, or greetings from neighbors? The very things we think of when we think of a homeland. All of this made my job of writing about return migration challenging, because I had to ask my characters to put into words all of these subliminal experiences. Many struggled, but others had no hesitation describing what a homeland is to them. When I asked Mohammed, a 30-something Palestinian living in a refugee camp in Bethlehem, to define what a homeland is to him, he replied, "A homeland is the place where you were born, where you have the experience, the friends, the heart, the feelings, even if it's very tough." A famous anthropologist, Fran Markowitz, writes that home is security, comfort, certainty. The people who have to take you in while understanding that the have to part is not a matter of externally imposed law, but an automatic response to similitude. Understanding this meaning of home is not a luxury. According to figures from UN, in 2024, there were 281 million people living in a country other than the one they were born in or identify with culturally. Let me repeat that number, 281 million people. By comparison, the 472 or so newcomers that Canada welcomed last year seem small and insignificant. Above all, returns question what we think we know about homes and homelands and the connection between the two. Many researchers suggest, and I would actually agree based on the reporting I've done, that returns have proven too thorny because of the contested nature of homelands themselves. The chapter set in Northern Ireland, the Basque region, Taiwan, and the mother of all motherland battles, Israel and Palestine, back me up. But I also argue that return gives people a chance to redraw boundaries and reclaim spaces that were once denied or lost to them, either because of politics, class, religion, or simply money, finance. I saw that most dramatically in Belfast and Jerusalem and surrounding area. When you return to a country that, under a different regime, kicked you out or left you no choice but to run away, you are in fact rewriting both your own history and that country's history. You are redefining its dynamics and its responsibilities to citizen, of which you are now one again. This is not an easy situation for the country of origin, or for the people who return to it. One of the recurrent themes of my conversations with the people who have returned is that they've always cast themselves as the main character in that story, that they're going to go home, back to their homeland, they'll be welcomed with open arms by long-lost relatives and high school friends. But the truth is, people have moved on. If you've left this country 30, 40 years ago, people have moved on. even if they recognize you, even if they've glad you're back, they have their own lives, they have their own priorities, they are struggling to make ends meet. You are no longer the main character in that story. Let's see, just one second. The word homeland obviously has the word home in it. A home, by which I mean a physical structure that literally stands for an immigrant's presence is an essential part of returnees' plan to turn a homecoming fantasy into a reality. Having a home, having a place back home that you call your own. That can be an additional story to a house in a Palestinian refugee camp in Gaza, or an Israeli settlement in the West Bank. A home of our own gets to stand for the homeland, for our connection to it. Before I started thinking about this book, I could never understand why so many immigrants I knew in Toronto who made good living would choose to live in very humble or rundown homes when they could clearly afford to move somewhere bigger or live in a better neighborhood. As I was working on the book, I started to press them, and many told me that they were saving to buy a place back home. Basically, they were living half a life in Canada with the other half of their income going towards a home in their homeland. I saw that most clearly with the Jamaican community, where owning a piece of the rock is as big of an immigrant dream as buying a home or condo in Toronto or Ottawa or Montreal or wherever. It's not just about immigrants maintaining or owning two homes. It's about creating the space, the mental and physical space for their duality, their double perspectives. But the home in the homeland is also a sanctuary from their harsh experiences in the host country, an escape hatch. One thing that united the many stories of return I heard around the globe, particularly from Black, Brown, and East Asian communities, was the unbearable burden of racism that they had experienced in their adopted homes, be that Canada, UK, France, US, Australia, whatever. The weight that almost all of them had to carry on their shoulders every day at work or in their homes cut them down. Like many immigrants, I've had my share of racism, but my privilege as an academic and writer and the income I earn from both has shielded me from some of the everyday racist encounters that people in frontline jobs and essential workers experience on a daily basis. I carry my class privilege with me, even when reporting on other people's experiences. And that legacy of racism, of hate, of fear for your own safety, I felt it the most in Ghana when I started talking to Canadian and Americans of Ghanaian origin who chose to return to Ghana. One of them was Foulé, a 30-something Canadian of Canadian origin whose parents have moved to Ottawa with the explicit sort of goal of providing him and his two brothers with a safe and comfortable life in Ottawa. But he has chosen to return to his parents' homeland after a less than spectacular employment record. But he put it to me in such simple terms. Quote, I was tired of living as a Black man in Canada. Not tired of life in Canada, but living with the legacy of racism. Another character I met somewhere else, sorry, I'm going to get to another character from Ghana in a second, but in between, there was a woman called Angela. If you read the book, then you immediately will recognize who she is. A 70-something mother of 4 children and a character I often get asked because her experience is so extreme that people think I made her up. She decided, after living in the US initially in Manitoba and then in Florida, she decided to go back to Jamaica, where not one, but two of her husbands were murdered. And she said that she feels much safer in Jamaica than she ever felt in Florida or in Manitoba. Returning to Ghana, one of the most memorable characters I have interviewed, probably in my entire life as a journalist, was Kwame, an older Black man from California who has decided to return to Ghana and describe his experience of living in the US as a trauma from which he needs to heal. When I met him, he was 63, and he told me at 63, he's learning to live as an African man. There are dozens of others you'll encounter in the book. I would just like to read a very small, a short excerpt from my conversation with Kwame. I ran into Kwame the day before we were scheduled to sit down for a talk. He assures me that he's still up for it, but insists that we sit at one particular table in the sprawling green compounds of the One Africa, the Cape Coast guest house where I was staying. With its panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean, there are no blocked or bad spots on the premises. But this particular wooden table, big enough for 4 people, holds a special place in Kwame's heart. He visited the resort for the first time in 1917 during his first week in Africa. I sat there and I had a meal. I was listening to this sound we're hearing right now, he told me, referring to the crashing ocean waves on the rocky bottom of the guest house. There's a powerful energy here, and I think about the spirit of our ancestors. He points to Elmina Castle to his right and the fishing boats in the distance, then stops for a few seconds to take some breaths. Even now, I'm just so full of emotion. Something happened to me here that's really powerful. I think I really connect with the ancestors and with the spirit of Africa. And I feel like I've really, really survived. 60 years in the US, and now I'm home. I've been a journalist for almost 25 years and a book author for 10, and I've never had an interview begin on such a spiritually content yet aching note, or in such magnificent setting. Kwame tells me that he's very emotional and has no problem with crying. By the time my conversation with him had ended 3 or so hours later, I had a better sense of why this returnee calls his story one of survival. In a nutshell, he's experienced all the classic stories that you probably expect of being a Black man in California, seeing friends and friends' children die, and also experience a number of health setbacks. It was while he was convalescing from operation that a friend who had just returned from Ghana visited him and mentioned that he had planned another visit in a few months. Kwame decided to go with him. And 6 months later, he was on a plane to Accra. I didn't come initially knowing I was going to stay. I came initially knowing I needed to love myself, Kwame tells me. I've been taking care of everyone in my life except myself, and I realized it was time for me to love me better. He concedes that the first trip was overwhelming, not because of what he saw on the ground in Ghana, but because he had been building it up in his mind. How does any country live up to half a century of longing? When a friend's son picked him up from the airport and drove him to where he would spend the next 5 weeks, Kwame struggled to maintain a conversation because he kept looking out his window. Everybody's African, he remembers thinking, as if that possibility had never occurred to him. Waking up to the sound of roosters and the bleating of goats felt like a spiritual awakening. And it revealed to me in that time This is where you need to be. You need to be right here. I made a decision right then. I'm going to move to Ghana. He returned to Auckland to sort out his business affairs, and on July 18, 2018, he re-entered Ghana, not as a tourist, but a permanent resident. Nothing is more powerful than a made-up mind, he tells me. He may visit California from time to time to check in on his mother, now in her late 80s, but his message to his children is clear. You want to see your daddy? You get a passport and come to me. He still worries about the future of his 4 sons, of course. He's watched many of his Black friends bury their children. He estimates he's been to at least 50 funerals of young men and women in his life. The trauma associated with that is way too much. We shouldn't have to live like that. In West Africa, he doesn't have to. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I'm talking to you during what seems to be a turning point in the politicization of hate and the use of disinformation as a weapon. History tells us that minorities, including migrants and refugees, tend to suffer the most from such weaponization. In fact, I don't know why I'm going back to history. The present moment is full of examples of a return of anti-gay, anti-trans organized movement. It was only a few years ago when children were separated from their parents as they crossed the Mexico-US border and housed in cages. In the US, the same movement has come after critical race theory and books that challenge a singular narrative about American history. In the UK, just this week, Parliament voted in support of shipping refugees to Rwanda to quote unquote process their status. We often think of Canada as immune from or superior to what's happening south of the border or in Europe. We like to think that our populism, the Fords, the Harpers, is exempt from anti-immigration or race-based violence. But we can only kid ourselves for so long. It's no wonder that some of us, I'm not saying that everyone, but some immigrants are trying to explore our options. They investigate links to homelands we thought we would not see again, except during family visits. Return is an insurance policy that I'm paying into in case our democratic institutions don't survive the next uprising or assault. Again, if you think I'm exaggerating, cast your mind back to January 6, 2021, Washington, and see how close one of the world's largest democracy has come to the brink of fascism. The stakes have only risen higher since. Repercussions of this vulnerability will be felt in the November election south of the border. Okay, I'm going to stop this line of inquiry before I lose all of you with this old doom and gloom. My final thoughts here are that one of the biggest tasks that anyone who's thinking about migration and people movement on a global scale needs to factor in is an understanding of the appeal of a return. It requires expanding the boundaries of our imagination. Knowledge is important, but imagination is infinite. I believe that understanding return is just as important as figuring out what lies ahead. I stress that learning about returns will help us plan for arrivals. And if that's a goal, integration. Another quote that stood out for me when I was working on the book comes from two scholars of return migration. The very definition of diaspora, they write, depends on attachments to a former home and typically on a fantasy of return. I feel like understand this or you don't understand immigration, migration, and people movement at all. We need to encourage newcomers to incorporate their past into the new narratives they are creating for themselves in Canada, to literally make space for the old country in the new. Such is the hold of homelands on migrants that any other approach may miss this essential connection. I know it can feel counterintuitive to move forward and look back constantly. It's a variation of the 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. But the past 7 or so years have proven to me that it is a natural human state. Who in this virtual room isn't looking back at what life was like before the pandemic, just as we are determined to make the most of the present moment and plan for the future, whatever that future may look like? We're all masters at looking back and masters of looking back and forward. We need to apply the same empathic approach to migration. I suggest we all heed the call that a homeland has on us and why some still think about it, dream of reconnecting with it to the point where they may wish to return on a more permanent or regular basis. It takes nothing from Canada's role as a host country, but I know that many disagree with me on this point. We as immigrants are capable of sustaining multiple belongings. We can express our love to Canada by speaking more than one language, by holding more than one place close to our hearts. A sense of belonging may be intuitive and more lasting when we don't have to erase parts of our past to make room for the present. As for me, as much as I'm settling here in Vancouver and kind of liking my new home, I'm often asking my siblings to keep an eye on waterfront condos coming up for sale in Aden, my birthplace. I want my own piece of the rock. Sadly, or maybe perhaps luckily, there's no multiple listings in Yemen. Otherwise, I would have spent an obscene amount of time fantasizing about my home in the homeland, a place to which I know I will return. Every time I have second thoughts or cold feet, I reread the sections in my book in which others have defied the odds, took a leap, and made the same journey. I'm confident that I will follow in their footsteps. Return is part of my destiny, and an ideal world should be thought of as part of every migrant's journey. Will it be part of yours? Thank you so much.
Kamal, thank you so much for that. Lots of food for thought. We are going to turn to questions now. And I have one here, and we'll just read it out. Did you encounter immigrants that returned home, then changed their minds and went back? And if so, what did they say?
Yes, great question. Yes, for some people, the return journey was not successful. And because I interviewed them in their home country, they had not returned yet in many ways. So, but what I managed to glean from them is that their return did not pan out the way they had hoped. It's not easy. They like Kwame was lucky in that his post first visit, his connection to Ghana only got stronger. Others, and the same chapter, I talked to 2 other women who came from very privileged middle class upbringing in the U.S. And they went and started to recognize the reality of living in Africa. You know, power outage, water shortage, issues, you know, like just the things that people who live in certain parts of the developed world take for granted. And they, in many ways, there's a quote from someone else who described them as like, they just wanted to recreate America in Africa. So it's a kind of a new, in a way, some kind of a new colonialism. Just the fact that you're black-skinned doesn't mean that you're not also coming to colonize again. So yes, there have been stories of people who thought they'll find themselves in their homeland, it didn't work out that way. In Taiwan, there's Jay, in particular, a young man who's like a lot, kind of, I don't want to say a lost soul, but someone who has struggled to find his place in Canada, thought the answer would be going back to Taiwan. He struggled more, a little bit in Taiwan, although later on he told me that he's in a better place than when I spoke to him, because I visited him in 2018 and wrote the book in 2021. So yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think that makes migration scary or return migration scary is that there's no formula. Whereas you can, for forward migration, inward migration, you can actually may take policies to welcome migrant immigrants to social housing, some other policies to kind of integrate language classes, whatever. When you go home, you're on your own. Some countries have a very sort of developed policies to kind of attract wealthy diaspora, but that's literally the 1%.
Right. Well, I mean, I think we're living in a new age. Obviously, earlier waves of immigrants to places like Canada, were not able to return, were not able to get on a plane, and had to live that return experience through music or art or other kinds of connections to their culture. On that note, I'm interested in your experience in Belfast, and because there's so many layers of identity there. And if you could maybe tell us a short anecdote about your experiences talking to people who had immigrated from there or returned to Belfast.
Yeah. I had a wonderful experience in Belfast, and actually I returned to Belfast last year for a conference, and many of the people I spoke to left during the Troubles in the sort of 70s and 80s until the Good Friday Agreement in the early 90s, and they left because they wanted to create something for themselves and for their kids. They wanted to protect their kids from having to live in the middle of sectarian violence. And they've had fantastic careers in the US, in Canada, and elsewhere. And yet something kept calling them back. And the Northern Ireland, like I'm just going to be specific, talk about the Northern Ireland government, is incredibly calculated about manipulating that desire to go home, about capitalizing on it, I should say, rather than manipulating. They have set up this well-oiled machine to welcome not just sort of direct foreign investment from the ones who've done really well, like in the tech sector, for example, but also to counter the brain drain, to invite people who are in high level positions in business, in technology, in fintech, and with incentives like the whole chapter in Belfast is set around this Belfast Homecoming Conference, which is all about, okay, you want to come back to Belfast. Okay, here's how you do it. Let's hear from different people's stories. What does Belfast have? What can Belfast offer to you? And in many ways, life is complicated, but it comes down to some very simple things like, okay, if you were in New York, you're lucky to have a one-bedroom apartment in a good neighborhood. But for that kind of money, you can buy a house with a backyard, and you can let your kids and roam free in the background. The commute is only 15 minutes. All these things that the big cities may have appealed to younger demographics are less appealing as they get older and they have their own children. But the thing I would emphasize here is that this connection that the people who were left Ireland to the homeland through songs, through dance, through pop, folklore, wherever. And of course, like it's in popular culture and everywhere. It's just so intrinsic to that story, that country, obviously, particularly, it's like Ireland as a whole, um, imported or, millions of people left after the famine, date of
That's
famine
right.
in the 19th century.
Yep.
And people, so their fifth and sixth and seventh generation still come back and settle in that tiny little hamlet where the great grandparents moved from.
Yeah. Well, there was reverse migration phenomena in Ireland generally in the last, 20 years has been quite remarkable. So
Mhm.
your story about Belfast is confirming and interesting. I just want to turn the questions just back towards Canada. And during the series here, I think there was a speaker who was talking about migration to smaller centers in Canada increasingly. And
Mm.
I was just wondering about your opinion, whether you think having a smaller environment with welcoming resources makes a difference in terms of actually helping people grab
Mm.
hold of their identity here in Canada rather than in big cities which are, as you mentioned in your talk, facing
Mm.
incredible pressures,
Yeah.
growth pressures primarily. Do you think it makes a difference if you end up migrating to a smaller community here in Canada?
I saw that in the series,
Mm,
obviously it's a fact. Like places like Brampton and Mississauga and Rexdale, that's just outside of Toronto, are people are just bypassing the center and going to the peripheries or the suburbs or the Whitby, and I'm thinking in here in Vancouver, Surrey, Richmond are all places that have maybe because they offer cheaper real estate and better better start to their careers. It it would really depend on the particular history of that migrant family. Um, for me coming or individual, for me coming as a I was in my 30s, early 30s, and the city was everything. Like being involved in the world of books and journalism and theater, you don't have those things necessarily in
right.
smaller towns.
Yes. Yes.
But what you might have um, is a quieter place. But I would like for me, it wouldn't be feasible for some practical reasons. Like I don't drive, for example, so that's not an option. But
Okay.
I I think there's safety in numbers in big city and in big cities. Like one of the reasons I fell in love with Toronto more or less instantly, I arrived on a Saturday and on a Sunday I was on the subway. Back then the subway ran on time. And so in the 90s, the subway was still a good public transport. And
I
and
take it
having
all
come,
the time.
you take
I take
it's
it all the
still good.
time. All is well. All is well.
Well, every time I come back to Toronto, it's like there's a stop or there's
I know.
service
I
has been
know.
interrupted. But having come from a relatively small town, Nottingham, for the previous 6 years, where I was the only non-white person on the bus, almost always, because I lived
Right.
outside of campus, getting on that subway and seeing the faces of who lived in Toronto, and I felt like I'm just one of them. I don't stand out. I look like 50% of everyone or if not more, every other person on that subway car looks, like me or looks like they come from somewhere else. That made me feel safe. I think that is one of the reasons I felt at home in Toronto in ways that maybe moving to somewhere where, I mean, a lot of my friends are sort of retiring into Stratford. And
Right.
that's not an option that I can think of, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Okay. Fair enough. Those are fair points to make.
Yeah.
I'm noticing the time, and I just want to leave just because you left your talk on a hopeful note. You paint a picture of a more open approach to migration, to the movement of people. Um, that's a wonderful and lofty goal. And, as walls are built, what does that look like for you going forward? That more open and malleable approach.
It actually means duality. I would like to have the option to live in Aden, speak my native tongue, live among, I hate to say it because, I think in many ways, Toronto people are my people as well, but live among. But I think what happened since the book came out, because I moved out of Toronto and moved here to Vancouver, is that it's not a all or nothing. I don't have to choose between the two. I'm 60 this year. I'm only a few years away from retirement, so I don't need to be in Canada to make a living.
Right.
And as a retired person, a snowbird basically. I'm going to snowbird, except I'm going to snowbird in the Middle East probably. Or,
Right.
yeah, that's how I see it. And my thinking since the book came out has also changed a lot. And it was much more either this or nothing. Now, why can't I have them both?
Right. Well, let's hope that we can, Canada can, integrate the thought about a back and forth and a more open approach as we continue to be a country of welcoming a lot of immigrants and expanding the population, which is obviously the goal recently. We so appreciate your time this evening, Kamal. Thank you for your deeply personal and and academic perspective on the phenomena of reverse migration. It was really interesting and thoughtful talk. Thanks to our audience this evening and to Nedra's excellent technical support, much appreciated. There is a short survey at the close of the program, so if you would please, audience members, take that, we'd appreciate it. As well, remember there's a host of interesting migration series events still to come, including a discussion of the books Ducks at the Port Hope Library tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Please visit the NLC website for a full description of what's ahead and how you can purchase tickets. And on that note, I will sign out. Thanks again, Kamal, and
thank you.
to the audience members who participated. And there's Charlie.
Hello, Charlie.
Hey,
So good
Kamal.
to see you, buddy.
That was terrific. Pleasure
Thank
to
you.
see you.
Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you. Good night.